laptop at home, and then it didn't work. It didn't copy over, and then I went to download it again. Download was gone. I had to go right back to press, and it's been a whole thing. So I will eventually get those back up here for you. They're having to send me a new download code, and the old one I had expired, and the one at school computer reset, and it's just been a mess. So I am working on it. I will try to get those back up. I like having those. I'm much more comfortable with those up here than not. It keeps me where I'm at and where I'm going. You all probably can't even see it half the time, but it's really more so for me than you all, because it kind of keeps me. This is what I'm used to doing. It's how I do it at school. It's just how I'm used to teaching. So I feel a little out of that, no safety blanket, not having that. Usually if I can get off on a tangent, it kind of gets me back. So I'll get those back up here as soon as I can get them to send the link back. And this is, again, it's just been a process of getting things taken care of. So especially I would have really liked to have it for today, because it has a good slide. Of course, we use it a bunch of times, but it has a timeline of all the judges, right? We get to chapter 3. We've gone over the state of Israel, why they kind of fallen on hard times as they have, and we finally get to the first judge here, Othniel, and it has a really good timeline of all the judges, but I'll get it up here eventually. That's who we're going to look at today. We'll actually look at the first couple of judges here, as God begins to use them to correct the behavior of the Israelites, to get them refocused on Him, and then all the things that kind of the rest of the book of Judges gets to. We get to look at the first one today. So we're going to start in chapter 3, verse number 7, is when we'll get to Othniel here in just a second. And if you think about, as we get into Othniel, and think about your job that you have or have had, or just jobs that you do, in any type of work that you do, think to yourself, I guess, what motivates you to complete the work, right? What motivates you to complete the work on your job, and how might your desire to work and to get the things finished that you're working on, how might that be different if your employer was not so faithful in compensating you for your work? God showed Israel, as we will see, faithfulness, sovereignty. They essentially had no excuse not to serve Him, but yet were not serving Him. He's going to reveal Himself to them, give some subtle prodding to the people of Israel as well, to kind of help them to respond. Now, as you have driven around or traveled different places, you will notice, especially during the summertime or in the holiday season, cities will go to great lengths to encourage the people driving through them to drive carefully, right? To make sure they're obeying speed limits. Of course, if you're on the interstate, usually getting close to a city, there's a big marquee sign that says buckle up, don't text and drive. Things have become more clever. You've probably seen those on the internet to get people to drive safely. Signs that detect the speed limit and kind of show if you're over it, it blinks, right? You're going over 55 or whatever. You've all seen these things, right? I'm taking Pippa and the girls to meet Mom earlier this week, and she's... Oh, she's something else. Anyways, we were driving, and I'm usually, guess what? I'm late, right? It's just, I'm usually late, just waiting. We're usually speeding, trying to get to pound. Usually somebody's gotten up late, or somebody's not wanting their hair fixed, or somebody's fallen down and busted a knee and crying, and it's just been chaos in the house for 45 minutes, and I'm trying to get the girls in, and Jay's trying to get them ready, and I'm frustrated, and you can imagine how things go. So I'm speeding down to meet Mom so I can be at least not terribly late for work. And Pippa she's picking up on stuff. She's noticing more stuff. She's starting to recognize the letters and numbers and things. And one of the things she likes to do is tell Daddy how fast he's driving in the car, right? Especially in the car, it's digital, so she can see. Daddy, you're going 47. 47. Yeah, I am. Well, this week we're driving, and she hollers back up at me, and she said, Daddy, you're going 49. 49. I said, well, yeah, you're going over the speed limit. How do you know that? That sign said you're supposed to be going 45. Okay, I guess you're right. There's all sorts of things that happen, right, that keep us to drive safely and to try to make sure that the highest number of people arrive to their destination safely. And what effect do those signs oftentimes have on you? Sometimes maybe no effect at all. You just go faster. I know the ones that flash how fast you're going usually slow me down quicker than anything else, because you kind of see just how fast you're going. What else prods us to obey traffic laws? The threat of getting a ticket, right? And having to pay that fine and have to pay the court costs and all the things that kind of add up to those things as well. God uses these judges we're going to see today as a prod in his hand to get the people to obey, right? And it uses consequences, the fear of what could happen, kind of prods them to obey. As we're going to see, the first two judges show Israel has no reason to not trust and obey God, and kind of see that we essentially correlate and don't have any excuse either not to obey God as well. Now, theocracy. Theocracy is a term that is used for God's direct rule over the nation of Israel, right? He is theocratic in his rule. He is the direct rule over the nation of Israel. Now, his rule remains in place even when he starts to appoint, first of all, Moses as his mediator, these judges as well. He continued to use his men to kind of mediate his rule. After Moses, he selects Joshua to take Moses' place, and then, of course, now the judges to represent him once Joshua passed away as well. Kings will eventually follow the rule of the judges as well, and rules by kings reached a pinnacle under, of course, King David. Jesus Christ, the son of David, will be the final monarchical mediator in Israel when he sets up his millennial kingdom in the future as well. Okay, so that's theocratic rule God has had over his people. The judges' narratives recognize God's rule, specifically as we get into these. An example here, Gideon, right? Gideon points out points out to Israel that God is their ruler. Jephthah names God as the ultimate judge over in chapter 11 that we'll see. The narratives of the book of Judges repeatedly points to the idea or the point or the importance that in those days there is no king in Israel, and every man did which was right in his own eyes. This phrase is here directly to draw our attention to Israel's need for David, which is God's eventual choice to be king. Of course, that's just a placeholder ultimately for Jesus Christ, right? And the final deliverer and King of Kings. So, first three mediators here that we're going to look at today show a continual part of God's sovereign plan over Israel. And the first one, again here, verses 7 through 11 in chapter 3, is Othniel. All right, God's faithful hand. The first one he uses here is the first cycle of Judges. The first judge in the first cycle, there we go, of Judges is Othniel. So let's go to verse 7 and verse 8, and we see why God brings up Othniel to start with. And the children of Israel, what does it say there in verse 7? Did evil in the sight of the Lord, right? And forgot the Lord their God and served Baalim and the groves. Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of the Chushan-Rishathaim king of Mesopotamia. And the children of Israel served Chushan-Rishathaim for 8 years. All right, so first cycle of Judges here gives Israel's rebellious actions in a very straightforward, concise manner. Verse 7, they did evil in the sight of the Lord and served and worshiped Baal. Right? So they're in direct violation of the Ten Commandments that was been given to them. Serving neither gods, having other gods before me, and they're exactly doing that. So they're in direct rebellion of the Mosaic Covenant, direct rebellion of the law that was given to them. They're serving Baal in the groves, which groves essentially refers to idols or wood carving carved images of the Canaanite goddess of fertility, Asherah. So they're not only just serving these other gods, they're worshiping false idols as well. So we can see the direct rebellion here from the law of God that the Israelites are following. Now, the groves that are mentioned, and you will see this, are mentioned a lot throughout Israel's history in the Promised Land, and they're always a source of contention between Israel and God. Back to verse 7, end of it, they're serving Balaam in the groves. What is ironic here about Israel worshiping essentially wooden images instead of God? What's kind of ironic about that? Who made the tree that the wooden image was made out of? God did, right? And there's some irony there. They're serving this piece of wood that God created that tree that made that image. Originally God's handiwork. Somebody cut it down, of course, carved it into an idol, and now they're serving this whatever it was. What particular part of a tree, especially now, springtime, shows God has a long track record of faithfulness? If you cut a tree down, what do you see? Inside of it, you see the rings, right? See how dendrologists will be able to try to age those trees because of those rings. And it shows that God is faithful because that tree, year after year after year, like especially now in the springtime, we're seeing these trees essentially come back to life, right? Now they weren't dead, but they've gone dormant. Now God's bringing them back to life. And it shows God's faithfulness to his creation. And those rings that were in that tree just shows how many times God has done this, right? Bring the rains down to make sure the trees are there, brings the extra sunlight in during the springtime, warms up, all the things that have to happen for those trees to come to life year after year after year. The idol had the tree rings all over it. That idol had God's faithfulness essentially all over it, right? But the Israelites, of course, are worshiping the wrong thing. The Canaanites worshiping Asherah, and they did this worship to her by setting up their groves, these idols, on high places. They obviously missed here the irony of using God's creation to worship the God that they had created, and sadly, of course, the Israelites are missing this as well, and they chose to worship created things instead of worshiping the Creator. Israel's sin here, of course, direct violation was directly against Yahweh, and God, of course, made himself known as Yahweh all the way back in Genesis chapter 22 when he talks to the first patriarchs and talks about the nation of Israel. Yahweh is a name God represented God with Israel. Moses warns Israel about forgetting Yahweh in their need. All right, so let's quickly just jump over to Deuteronomy. We're spending a lot of time talking about the Israelites forgetting God, but it's important here that we see this. Deuteronomy chapter 8, and look at verse 14. We'll read down to verse 19. All right, so Moses here warning the Israelites, here for some context, about forgetting that Yahweh was near to deliver them and then to provide for them. And we see the pride of Israel kind of lead them to believe here, verses 14 through 18. Then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led thee through the great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought where there was no water, who brought thee forth water out of a rock of flint, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee, and to do thee good at the later end. And thou said in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hands hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, and establish his covenant, which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. And it shall be, if thou do all that forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you this day, that ye shall surely perish. What did Israel's pride lead them to believe? That what? That who had...
That they had gotten
Exactly, right? That they had done something, their own power, by their own attrition, had managed to gain wealth, had gained their power, had been able to get to where they were by something they had done on their own. When in fact, of course, we know that God was the one that had blessed them with that. Israel had came to believe that they were responsible for their success and for their wealth, and had forgotten what God had done for them, and therefore quit relying on Him for their needs. They made a choice here to worship Baal. They made a choice to worship Asherah and the other fertility deities here in Canaan. Now, the Canaanites believed that their gods controlled the rains, right? That's why they worshiped Baal and Asherah. They believed that they were in charge of the rains. The rains then bring crops to grow, allows land to be fertile. So that's what they were thinking, that's why they thought that they did this, and that's why they thought the bumper crops and things they were accustomed to seeing in Canaan were directly related because of their worshiping of these fertility deities. Israel accepted the belief and practice of this Canaanite religion. So in a sense here, Israel believed that they gained direct control of their wealth because Baal and Asherah were obligated to reward them because of their worship and sacrifice. Okay, they worked for Baal and Asherah. Baal and Asherah were blessing them with these things instead of having faith in God. Okay, Israel forgot God. Right? That's what they did here. They are forgetting what God had done for them. And this is a very, very serious charge because Israel had coveted with God to serve and worship Him, right? There had been a covenant. We've seen these now multiple times, talked about these covenants. To worship Him and serve Him exclusively. Nobody else, nothing else, no other thing. They are abandoning that responsibility, forgetting God. And of course, as we know, God does not take this lightly. And as Judges chapter 3 verse 8 tells us, that when the Israelites do this, the anger of the Lord was what? It's hot, right? It's not just kind of there. It's not just festering. It's hot. It's bubbling over. He's had enough of what these Israelites are doing. So because of that, he sells them into the hand of the king of Mesopotamia, Cushan Rishathaim, who was again the king of Mesopotamia. He takes Israel's abundance by force. The abundance that God had promised to keep for Israel for keeping His covenant with them. So, God has been faithful to the Israelites. He told them, if you serve other gods, if you worship other gods, you're going to face the consequences. And He's being faithful to that promise here in verses 7 and 8. Now, jump down to verse number 9 and 10 and 11, and we see Israel here crying out to God. Even when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised up a deliverer to the children of Israel who delivered them, even Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and went out to war, and the Lord delivered Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against Cushan Rishathaim. And the land had rest 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So, we can assume here, even after the invasion by the Mesopotamians here, that the Israelites are sticking to the plan of worshiping the Canaanite deities. All right? But Baal and Asherah, of course, being false gods, obviously are not going to respond to the Israelites when they cry out to them for help because of them being enslaved by the Mesopotamians. So these false gods prove to be unfaithful. So eventually, verse 9, we see the Israelites understanding that the only person that can deliver them, of course, is God. And they cry out. And they cry out to God. God responds. by raising up Othniel as the first judge of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord, it said in verses 9 and 10, there came upon Othniel, empowered him. He leads Israel in defeating the king and defeating the Mesopotamians. Of course, Othniel, we find out, was Caleb's nephew. Caleb gave his daughter Aksha to Othniel as a marital reward for conquering the city of Debir during the conquest back over in Joshua 15. Othniel had a track record of being faithful and was ready to serve God again when God called him some time later now to be one of his judges. The land had rest as a result of this, we see, for 40 years. Okay, so because of the faithfulness of Othniel, Israelites got rest for 40 years. It's important to note that Othniel comes from the tribe of Judah, and that's significant, of course, because it shows that, continuing here, just as God said, Judah is kind of a leadership role. The tribe of Judah is in a leadership role amongst the other tribes, and it reminds the reader of us that God's plan all along is to have the ultimate deliverer be a descendant from the tribe of Judah. Okay, so what we're seeing is, and we'll see this a lot, right? There's some one-off things that kind of happen, that these people come from the tribe of Judah, they act as leaders and bring Israel out of their rebellion for a time, and it just all kind of falls right in the plan with Jesus Christ ultimately coming from the tribe of Judah as well. So it's important for us not to get lost on the foresight here of what God is doing as well, right? Even in the midst of all these different skirmishes, all these different rebellions, all these different things going on, there's still an ultimate plan that God is allowing to take place through all of this, right? And again, from a bird's eye view of this, it's kind of amazing to see the sovereignty of God to allow all these things to happen and yet still satisfy all the promises that he made, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before this, okay? Because, of course, we know God, all sovereign, all these things, but to actually see these check marks essentially kind of be checked in this list of things that have to happen, or that God said would happen, we're seeing that take place kind of right here before us, which is pretty neat. God eventually made a promise to David that his throne would last forever. That's over in 2 Samuel. The final king of the throne would be Jesus Christ, and he sets up his millennial kingdom, as we've already kind of mentioned. All right, that brings us to verse number 12, and the second of the first triage here of Judges, Ehud. And Ehud is God's sovereign hand here. Verses 12 through 14, the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord, and he gathered unto him the children of Ammon and Amalek, and went and smote Israel, and possessed the city of palm trees. So the children of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. So we've had now a 40-year period of rest, okay, in which the Israelites have not been in captivity of another king or another nation. And we see that just after 40 years, the cycle of apostasy begins again. Now, 40 years is close to a generation of people, right? What got Israel into this mess to start with? We talked about the last couple of weeks. Why did the Israelites end up having these complications, all these other problems? What caused this? Rebellion, right? What was the reason? What was the reason for the rebellion? We said. Exactly, right? The next generation didn't teach their kids the importance of serving God, okay? 40 years, again, pretty much a generation. What do we see happening again? They're rebelling again, right? They're not listening to God. Why do you think that probably happened? Same thing, right? Track record says that their kids lived through the 8-year captivity, watched God deliver, then they didn't pass that on to their children, so we see them now doing the exact same thing. Every time the Israelites go through this, I think we can stem it back to the source of them not passing on the importance of serving God, right? So these people are continuing to fall into this same cycle of being rebellious. And we see it. For 40 years, another cycle of apostasy begins. So, just like it happened before, in response to Israel's evilness, the Lord strengthens Eglon here, the king of Moab, to go against Israel. The Moabites are related to Israel through Lot, Abraham's nephew, Lot's son. Moab and Ammon were the result of the incestuous relationship that Lot had with his daughters. Okay? That was a lot. Let me say that again. Okay? The Moabites are related to Israel through Lot. Okay? So the Moabites are there because of Lot. All right? Lot's incestuous relationship that he had with his daughters. They had Moab and Ammon of the Ammonites, right? Both of those boys fathered these nations that eventually became enemies of Israel. And how many times do we hear the Moabites and the Ammonites coming up against Israel? Like, it's happening all the time. If Lot would have never done what he did, these people would not have even, we're beginning to see the consequences of actions, right? And many, 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 many years down the road, because of Lot's sin and his poor decisions, we're still seeing the consequences of that as well, okay? And I think God uses these nations specifically to kind of, to teach the Israelites a lesson, to teach us as the readers a lessons that choices have consequences, right? Good or bad, right? Bad ones will come back and haunt you. They'll still be there. You got to live with both of them, make better choices, right? And then you have better consequences because of that. So that's why we kind of see these people that are here throughout this. How much success would have Eglon had against Israel without the Lord's strength? None, right? If the Lord hadn't kind of boistered Eglon's abilities or strengthened him, and however he did that, he would have had no strength against Israel at all. Go to Romans chapter 13 with me real quick and look at verse number 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. To what extent does God control who's in political position in the nations of the world? Go back to verse 31. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. So who's in control of things ultimately? So who puts these people in power? Right? Absolutely, right? God puts them in. There is no. God installs and removes leaders according to his will. Okay? Eglon, completely unaware, probably, that God strengthened his nation for a divine purpose. He undoubtedly credited himself for the success of his military and the strength, or maybe probably his gods. He probably gave them some credit as well. He emboldened, he forges an alliance here with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, against Israel, pretty common enemy. The Amalekites also relatives of Israelites. The Amalekites descended from, anybody know? Can you remember? Who did the Amalekites descend from? Anybody remember? Esau, right? The Amalekites came from Esau, Jacob's twin, okay? We don't have time. Genesis chapter 36, all right? That's in there. Verses 12 through 17, 12 through 18, something like that. Have it written down somewhere. But we see that the Amalekites come from Esau, Jacob's twin. There's an evil axis that took possession of Jericho, the city of palms, which is on the west side of the river. The Moabites are going to use the Jericho or the city of palms there as the kind of their home base in the promised land, because it's unoccupied, first of all, and it's in a very strategic location. Okay, there was a reason that Jericho was the one Joshua kind of came in. There's a reason that was there. Okay, it was very strategic for the rest of the land. At this point, it is unoccupied because the Israelites hadn't done what they're supposed to do. So the Moabites take over it. It's their home base, and it's there. See, Joshua's orders, of course, way back when they took over Jericho and when they first moved in, Joshua's orders were that no one was to rebuild the city. This is Joshua 6:26, if you want to flip over and look at it. Its ruins stood as a monument of sorts to God's power. So when the Moabites took possession of Jericho, the message to Israel was that God could easily dispossess the promised land if they persisted in their obedience, right? So Jericho was still there, still in rumbles or in shambles. It would have been as a kind of a monument for what they did. So when the Moabites came in and took over, it showed how quickly God can allow the Israelites to not possess the land anymore. Okay? If they continue to be disobedient. The Moabites kept Israel under their power for 18 years, as we see in verse 14 of Judges chapter 3. So the children of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, for 18 years. Long enough, 18, 19, 20 years, again, long enough for people to get married and to have babies and then kind of have beginning to start of a new generation, right? We kind of see how this kind of took place. So the youth in Israel, so there's 18 years worth of kids. The youth in Israel didn't know what life was like outside of being the slaves or being dominated or occupied by a foreign nation. They wouldn't have known that. Okay, that's all they would have known. Failure and weakness would have been the norm for them. Okay, that brings us to verse 15, and we see God raising up a deliverer. Eventually, Israel kind of gets enough of this new normal and grow tired of this king kind of taking charge and taking over it. When the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised them up a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Jair, a Benjamin, a man left-handed, and by him the children of Israel sent to present unto Eglon, the king of Moab. But Ehud made him a dagger which had 2 edges of a cubit length, and he did gird it under his raiment upon his right thigh, and he brought the present unto Eglon, king of Moab. And Eglon was a very fat man. When he had made an end to offer the present, he sent away the people that bare the present. But he himself turned again from the quarries that were in Gilgal, and said, I have a secret errand unto thee, O king, who said, Keep silence. And all that stood by him went out from him. And Ehud came unto him, and was sitting in a summer parlor, which he had for himself alone. And Ehud said, I have a message from God unto thee. And he arose out of his seat. And Ehud put forth his left hand, and took the dagger from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the haft also went in after the blade, and the fat closed upon the blade, so that he could not draw the dagger out of his belly. And the dirt came out. Then Ehud went forth through the porch, and shut the doors of the parlor upon him, and locked them. When he was gone out, servants came, and when they saw it, and behold, the doors of the parlor were locked, they said, Surely he covereth his feet in his summer chamber. And they tarried there till they were ashamed, and behold, he opened not the doors of the parlor. Therefore they took a key and opened them, and behold, the Lord was fallen dead down on the earth. And Ehud escaped while they tarried, and passed beyond the quarries, and escaped into Sereth. And it came to pass, when it was come, he blew a trumpet in the mountain of Ephraim, and the children of Israel went down with him from the mount, and he before them. And he said unto them, Follow after me. The Lord hath delivered your enemy, the Moabites, into your hand. And they went down after him, and took fords of Jordan towards Moab, and suffered not a man to pass over. And they slew of Moab at that time about 10,000 men, all lusty, all men of valor, and there escaped not a man. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and left in the land had rest for 80 more years. Okay, so I got 7 minutes here. Let's go over. Let's recap what Ehud did real quick. All right. Eventually, Israel gets tired of getting their money and stuff taken. So again, they cry out to the Lord for help. The Lord, of course, again, merciful, and brings up Ehud as the next judge. Ehud was a tribe of Benjamin. Okay, the city of Jericho was within the territory of the Benjamites. So it makes sense that the judge was from that tribe. The tribe of Benjamin later develops into a specialized, this is cool, okay? And we're going to see this over in verse 16, 17 of chapter 20. But the tribe of Benjamites later develops into a very specialized force of 700 left-handed soldiers, okay? All of this stemming back from Ehud, okay? Who could sling stones with amazing accuracy. And Ehud was also left-handed, a trait that came into play in his role as a judge. And we'll get into why that's important here in just a second. Israel appoints Ehud to carry tribute to the king of Moab. Ehud saw the trip as an opportunity to be alone with the king, and to prepare for that moment, he makes an 18-inch double-edged sword and straps it to his right thigh, where it would be concealed from anyone who might suspect him to have a weapon. Now, even now, left-handed people are kind of not the norm, right? When Pippa's left-handed, I am left-handed, right? And Haley is right-handed. And when Pippa does things left-handed, Haley's like, man, this just looks so strange, right? Because it does. It looks different when you see somebody left-handed, because you aren't used to seeing it, okay? These people definitely, we have a little more notoriety for left-handed, left brain, right brain, how things work now. They would have had really no idea. As a matter of fact, most soldiers, if they had been left-handed, especially in these pagan armies, so the Moabites, the left-handed people weren't soldiers. They were doing something else. That was kind of one of the things because they had to hold their shield a certain way and their spear or sword a certain way. If you were left-handed, you didn't have the strength to do things, jab with your right hand. So they weren't even soldiers at all, for the most part. It's how most of these ancient armies kind of worked. So this is why this little snapshot of Ehud being left-handed is so important, because they would have never suspected him. They probably checked his right thigh, or his left thigh, because that's where he would have concealed something. They're not going to check the right one, because that would have been, why would you do that if you're right-handed, right? So that's why we kind of see this happening. Of course, when we read the story, he goes in, he gets Eglon there by himself, supposedly brings the tribute in that he's supposed to. We see that he's a very fat man. The word fat there is most of the time associated with animals who had been fattened by feeding them extra food. So if you see the translation of Eglon being a fat man there, it's the same type of translation that was used that is used when they're fattening up calves and stuff for slaughter. Okay, same thing. Eglon thinks that he is going to get tribute from Ehud. We see, of course, Ehud standing up at the opportune moment, reaching down to his right thigh, pulling out the dagger, and sticking it into his belly of the unsuspecting king. And I think this is an interesting part here, right? Eglon is obviously not just like a little bit fat. He's like a real fat. This is an 18-inch dagger. That's the blade is 18 inches, not counting what the handle is, right? And Ehud sticks that thing all the way into his belly so far that it encloses the whole thing around, right? That's how fat this guy is. The sword was literally swallowed by the king's belly. He had to let go of it. He had to let go of it and flee without his weapon because of how far he had lodged in there. He left him to die. As we see here, the Bible describes it as the dirt fell out, and that's essentially meaning that his guts are falling out, right? His guts are falling out there on the ground. And he leaves and escapes through a porch and leaves Eglon locked in this room. Now, the Eglon's people come to check on him. The door's locked. Well, he thinks he's just in there sleeping. Was being polite. You don't just go barging in on the king, right? The door's locked. It's kind of, so they waited. But again, realizing he should have come out at some point, they eventually go in and check and see the gruesome nature with which their king had died. Okay? Now, you can focus on Ehud's ingenuity, his cleverness, as the main point of the story, and it was. This is a very intelligent, very clever thing for Ehud to do, but God's superintendence of the events here should really be the focus, right? God showed his sovereignty overall. He strengthens Eglon to come into the promised land, put his people under tribute. Eglon had no clue he was being used by God to punish the Israelites. God then works through Ehud to deliver his people in a risky yet highly successful operation. And the fact that Ehud was left-handed, of course, is no coincidence here, right? It's exactly the way God formed Ehud in his mother's womb to be left-handed so this could happen, and so this could take place, so he could surprise Eglon with this attack. So as we finish up here, what should Israel conclude about God's sovereignty from this story? That God is sovereign over all nations, uses his sovereignty to both oppress and to deliver, and that God is always just in how he exercises his sovereignty. 40 years takes place, another 40 years of peace in the land, and as we jump into verse 31 next week, we'll see that this then just happens again, and God has to bring up Shamgar to use that as a prod to get Israel into the right direction. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this story, for this account here that took place, and how you use the sovereignty of just what you can do, and how sovereign that you are, and always being faithful to these not faithful people. Because of the covenant and the promises you gave them. And we're thankful, Lord, for your faithfulness to us, even when we aren't real good sometimes. Your faithfulness to us, your grace to us, Lord, to bring us back into the fold. Sometimes it takes the prodding and some corrective measures to get us, Lord, but we're thankful that you don't just leave us out into the wilderness by our own, but you always bring us back in, Lord, and we're so thankful for that, thankful for your love that does that for us, Lord. And we don't take that ever for granted, Lord, because of the importance of our lives. Pray for Pastor Rob here as he comes in the next little bit too, Lord. Keep us attentive to your words you have us through him this morning.